They say therapy rooms are designed to feel safe. Soft light, neutral colors, silence, thick enough to hold 1,000 secrets. Mine had a window once, but I covered it years ago. Too much truth leaked through the glass. I told my patients it was for privacy, but really, it was because I couldn't stand seeing the world outside still moving, while mine stayed perfectly, painfully still. My name is Dr. Eliza Harrow, clinical psychologist, 42, London. I've spent 15 years listening to other people's storms. Depression, addiction, the silent wars of marriage, all poured into my notebook, neat handwriting disguising chaos. People called me empathetic. Some called me gifted. I preferred necessary. Because when you're the one who listens, you don't have to speak. When I was younger, I thought therapy was a kind of priesthood, confessions without God, forgiveness without ritual. You sit, you listen, you heal. It sounded noble, but no one tells you how the human mind seeps into yours like damp through old walls. After years, you start to hear voices at night, not of madness, but of memory. Every patient leaves a residue, guilt, desire, grief, need. And when you close the door, they don't really leave, they just change seats. Sometimes you become the one on the couch. I lived alone in a flat above a florist. The smell of cut stems and pollen clung to the curtains. Every evening I'd boil water, sit at my kitchen table, and write notes I'd never submit. Loneliness is not a symptom, it's a species. Empathy is the slowest form of suicide. Those were my private sessions, the ones where I was both therapist and patient. He came on a Tuesday. Rain had been falling since morning, a polite British drizzle that made everything smell like wet wool. His name on the file was Daniel Quinn, 32, former journalist, anxiety, self-isolation post-accident, typical case. I almost didn't notice the tremor in my fingers when I opened the door. He didn't look like the others, not broken, not searching. He had the look of someone already halfway through an escape, like he'd slipped out of something dangerous and hadn't yet decided whether to regret it. His first words were almost a whisper. They said, "You're the one who listens without judging." I smiled, professional, practiced. "That's my job." He nodded. "Then maybe you're the one who can stop me from disappearing." Something in the way he said disappearing stayed with me. Most patients talk about pain. He talked about erasure. Over the next weeks, Daniel became a routine. Every Thursday, 10 a.m., the sound of his boots on the carpet, the faint scent of tobacco and rain. He told stories about the accident, a car crash, a friend lost, a life paused. But between the cracks, I heard something else. Guilt, sharp and alive. He said he couldn't write anymore, that words betrayed him. And when I asked what he meant, he looked straight at me and said, "You wouldn't understand what it's like to heal others for a living and have no one to heal you." It was the first time a patient had ever turned the mirror around. And in that reflection, I saw myself, tired, hungry for connection, pretending that professionalism was purpose. There's a moment therapists rarely admit to, the moment you stop hearing the words and start hearing the person. His voice became the only one that didn't dissolve into background noise. His laughter lingered longer. When he spoke, my pen slowed, then stopped. It wasn't attraction at first. It was recognition. Two people circling the same wound from different sides of the couch. I remember one session vividly. He said, "You know, sometimes I think you look lonelier than I do." I laughed it off. Occupational hazard. He smiled. "Then maybe you need saving too." That night, I didn't write my usual notes. Instead, I replayed the sentence, "Maybe you need saving too," until it became a lullaby and a threat. By the 5th month, I began breaking rules, small ones at first, letting sessions run longer, replying to one of his emails after hours, accepting a coffee when he offered to continue the conversation somewhere less clinical. The ethical codebook calls it boundary drift, but boundaries don't drift. They dissolve quietly, like sugar in tea. I told myself it was part of his therapy, exposure, trust building, integration. But beneath every rationalization, I could feel something ancient and dangerous. The hunger to be seen not as a therapist, not as a function, but as a woman. People imagine temptation as a lightning strike, sudden, blinding. It isn't. It's more like erosion, the same wave returning every day until the cliff gives way. He started asking about me, not my credentials, but my life, where I grew up, why I became a therapist, whether I believed people could ever really change. And each answer felt like handing him a key I didn't remember hiding. One afternoon, as he left, he said softly, "You always let people go before they finish saying what they need." And for the first time, I didn't correct him. Maybe that was when it began. Not love, not desire, but the slow dismantling of distance. Every therapist builds a fortress. Mine had windows once, then curtains, then walls. Daniel was the first to knock. Now, when I listen to my own recordings, I hear it. The shift. My tone softens. My silences lengthen. It's the sound of a professional forgetting the script. And in that silence, something dangerous started breathing between us. They teach you in training that most violations begin with a good reason. A client might spiral after hours. A message requires a gentle reply. A boundary bends, just for tonight, for care, for safety, for the work. The good reason is the bridge you build to cross the river you swore you'd never enter. I told myself I was helping Daniel reclaim the world. If trauma had shrunk his life to a corridor, then I would walk with him until the doors opened again. Exposure, I called it. Common humanity. Trauma-informed practice. I spoke like a textbook to disguise the fact that I'd stopped reading. On Thursdays, we started meeting 10 minutes early. He'd arrived damp from the London weather, cheeks pink, palms cold. "Your room always smells like flowers," he said once. "That's the shop downstairs," I answered. "I live above it." "Do you like it?" "I like the illusion," I said. He asked, "What illusion?" "That we can choose the scenes of our life," I said. "Light, scent, sound." He nodded like a person receiving permission. The following week, he brought a small paper bag from the florist. Inside, eucalyptus leaves and one pale rose. "For the illusion," he smiled, setting it on the table. I should have shut it down. Gifts complicate the work. Instead, I fetched a vase from the sink and we both watched the water climb the stem. A good reason. Regulate his nervous system with sensory anchors. A secret. I kept the vase after hours, on my kitchen table. He told me more about the accident. 2 friends, a motorway, a storm. He survived. The friend did not. His mouth tightened when he spoke of it. His hands didn't. They floated as if rehearsing a confession he couldn't finish. "Do you believe in second chances?" he asked. "I believe in work," I said. "We build our chances. And if the building requires shortcuts?" "Shortcuts cost later." He smiled sadly. "You speak like a judge hiding behind mercy." Something in me flinched, because he was right. I had begun to pass sentences inside my silence. On him, on me. The first email came at 11:42 p.m. Subject: Can't breathe. Text: I know the rules, but the room feels far away tonight. Can you just tell me whether I'm a monster for wanting to keep living? My cursor blinked like a metronome for panic. I typed, deleted, typed. "You're not a monster. You're grieving and you're human. Count 10 breaths." Inhale, hold, exhale. If you need more structure, write this down. 3 things you can see, 3 you can touch, 3 you can hear. I paused, then added, "We'll talk in the morning. You're not alone." I didn't sign it Dr. Harrow. I signed it Eliza. A good reason? Crisis containment. A secret? I slept with the phone on my pillow until dawn. In supervision, I didn't mention Daniel by name. I said a client had become central. My supervisor asked, "Central to the work or central to your week?" I wanted to say both. I said neither. She suggested tightening the frame, clear limits on contact, reinforce structure. I nodded while scribbling nothing. When I left, I called Daniel and asked if he'd like to try a session outdoors. Phobia work in motion. It sounded clinical enough to pass as virtue. We walked the canal towpath near Angel, a gray ribbon of water pacified by ducks and commuters. He kept a careful distance at first. "What should I talk about?" he asked. "Whatever comes," I said, and immediately regretted the open door. He did not talk about the accident. He talked about his mother's laugh, his father's silence, the first time he lied for love, and the first time someone lied to him for survival. He asked me if I'd ever lied for love. "Everyone does," I said. "What was your lie?" "That I needed less than I did." He looked at me as if I had confessed to a holy crime. The line between therapy and companionship is a thread on a windy day. One tug, and everything unravels. He proposed coffee after the walk. "For grounding," he said, and I heard myself agree, because coffee is a public thing, and public things can be justified. We sat in the corner of a small cafe where the espresso machine hissed like a patient refusing intubation. He asked about my books, my favorite films. I spoke in safe nouns. He spoke in warm verbs. When the cups were empty, he thanked me for risking the world with him. I said it was good work. He laughed softly. "Is that what you call this?" The bill arrived. We both reached. His hand brushed mine. Static climbed my wrist like a rumor. I withdrew. He watched me curate the distance and looked almost relieved. Boundaries can be a lover too. Reliable, predictable, faithful. There were weeks when he seemed better. He returned to writing. Columns at first, then essays. He credited the exposure work, the breathing practices, the way I didn't blink when the worst parts came out. He brought drafts for me to not read and then read anyway. I underlined verbs and circled metaphors, careful to call it narrative therapy. He started signing his emails with D instead of Daniel, as if we had entered the apartment of familiarity and removed our shoes. Sometimes, after he left, I would replay the session on my phone, listening for the moment my voice softened or my breath shortened. I told myself I was auditing technique. I was rehearsing feelings. I began dressing differently on Thursdays. Not dramatically, just a blouse that made me stand straighter, a scent that lingered a beat longer after the hour. If a patient noticed, I'd call it mood congruence. When Daniel noticed, he simply said, "You seem more here." I didn't ask what here meant. We both knew. Backstory is a sedative. If you take enough of it, you can sleep through the present. When he asked about my past, I rationed truth like medicine. I told him my father left when I was 9, and I learned to stop asking questions whose answers couldn't return. I told him I married young, that the marriage ended with a tidy divorce and untidy dreams. I did not tell him about the pregnancy that didn't make it to a picture frame, or the year my body forgot how to be a home. I did not tell him that the profession I chose, sitting with other people's grief, was the closest I could get to holding a child without breaking. He told me he used to cover wars. I asked why he stopped. He said, Because one day I realized I preferred the hotel bar to the front line. That's how you know you're done. I laughed, then hated myself for liking the way he confessed his cowardice like a poem. If I were your friend, he said, I'd tell you to stop working after 6. If you were my friend, I said, you wouldn't be my patient. We both let the sentence float between us like a bridge we admired and refused to cross. Then came the day the bridge built itself. He arrived 30 minutes early. There had been a flash flood on his street. His flat was damp, his voice raw. Everything smells like rot, he said, shivering. I found a blanket in the cabinet, a prop for trauma work, and wrapped it around his shoulders. The professional gesture felt like a hand lingering a fraction too long. His eyes followed the movement. So did mine. During the session, he cried for the first time. Not a cinematic sob, not a staged humiliation. The quiet kind that slips out when someone finally believes they are safe enough to admit the world has been unkind. Something inside me loosened. The therapist in me named it breakthrough. The woman in me named it permission. When the hour ended, I didn't stand. He didn't either. Silence stretched into a new kind of agreement. I'm afraid of the day I stop needing this, he said, almost childlike. You won't, I said, and it came out too quickly, too hungry. He looked at me with a tenderness that should never appear in that room. Eliza, he said, for the first time without the doctor, do you ever wish the world were smaller? Just 2 chairs, 1 hour, a closed door. Yes, I said, sometimes I do. A good reason. Name the transferences to diffuse them. A secret. I didn't. After he left, I walked to the sink, ran the tap, and held my wrists under cold water until the bones ached. I stared at the pale rose he'd brought weeks earlier, now fading in its vase, soft brown edging the petals like a bruise. It felt like a warning disguised as tenderness. Everything lovely decays into what it was before we named it. That night, his email arrived at 1:03 a.m. I keep hearing your voice after I leave. It makes the city sound less empty. I don't know if that's healthy, but I'm not ready to stop. D. I replied at 1:10 a.m. My voice belongs to you in the hour. After that, it's memory. Memories are allowed. E. Memories are allowed. I read it 3 times, understanding I had given consent to a ghost to live in his apartment. And in mine. We moved 1 session to Saturday. It was practical, I said. His freelance deadline had swallowed Thursday. Saturday made the building quieter, the hallway longer, the air more conspiratorial. Rain didn't fall that day. Sun poured across the carpet like an alibi. He sat, I sat. Time slowed. You know what changed? He asked. What? You started telling me about you. I've always, not like this, he tilted his head. You're careful with everyone, but you hope with me. I felt heat rise in my throat. That's the work, I whispered. He leaned forward slightly. Is it? I looked at the door. I looked at the rose. I looked at the man who had entered my life through a file and had somehow become the book I couldn't stop reading. I'm worried, I said finally. About me? About me, I said. He closed his eyes as if savoring a truth he'd baited for months. Then he opened them and met my gaze with a steadiness that felt like standing at the edge of a cliff and not minding the wind. Then let me say the thing we're not allowed to say, he whispered. I don't want the hour to end. The clock on the shelf ticked as if announcing a verdict. I could have stood. I could have invoked policy. I could have called the moment by its proper name. Boundary violation. Emerging dual relationship. Risk. And handled it like a fire drill. I didn't. I said, then don't leave yet. Later, I would try to file that sentence under strategy. Containment in the room to prevent acting out outside. Later, I would tell myself that the most ethical thing I could do was keep the risk where I could see it. Later, I would learn that the moment you rename a feeling as a technique, it grows teeth. He stayed. We spoke about everything but the thing itself, the way people do when the truth is too bright to stare at. He told me about his favorite place by the sea as a boy. I told him about a summer in Whitstable where the wind climbed inside my sweater and refused to leave. The stories braided themselves into a third presence in the room, something neither of us had permission to touch, and both of us craved. When he finally stood, the room felt thinner. He didn't go to the door. He came to the window, the one I'd covered years ago. He touched the fabric. "What's behind?" "Light," I said. He turned. "And what happens if we let it in?" I heard the ocean he'd described crash against my ribs. I heard every rule I'd ever agreed to assemble like a chorus. I heard my own voice, tired of obeying a God I wasn't sure I believed in anymore. "Safety. Another time," I said. He nodded, slow, like a man accepting a sentence he had written himself. He reached for the handle of the door. Then he paused, as if remembering a line. "Eliza?" "Yes. I'm getting better," he said. "Is that allowed, if it hurts you?" The door clicked behind him. I sat very still, like a witness waiting to give testimony no one would accept. In the vase, the rose shed a petal. It landed on my notes, over the phrase I had written at the top of the page that morning. "Maintain frame." I picked up the petal and pressed it between the pages of my notebook, as if I could flatten what had just risen. I told myself I was still in control. I told myself this was still good work. I told myself that to heal a man, you must sometimes hold him where he breaks and say, "I see you. I won't run." A good reason, a first fracture, and the world beyond the curtains waited, bright and hungry. They say the first rule of transference is never believe the version of yourself that exists in your patient's eyes. But what if that version feels truer than the one in your mirror? It began innocently, a late Saturday, the session that should have ended and didn't. Rain hammered the window like a secret begging to be told. We'd been talking about fear. His fear of sleeping, mine of stopping. He said, "You don't rest either, do you?" I said, "Rest feels like falling." Then there was silence, and I realized I had leaned forward, too close. The next thing I remember is warmth, his hand, my sleeve. That fragile second between professional and personal, where gravity does the deciding. I could have stepped back. Instead, I stayed very still, waiting for the moment to break me. When it didn't, I mistook survival for consent. The following week, we didn't talk about it. We talked around it, in metaphors and therapeutic language. He spoke of trust exercises, of learning to reattach. I asked what attachment felt like now. He said, "Like your voice, close to my skin." I should have redirected. I should have documented the slip. But my notes from that day read only, "Patient showing progress. Emotional regulation improved." That's how denial sounds when written in ink. We started staying after the hour. Sometimes he'd help me rearrange bookshelves, carry a box, change a light bulb. Tasks with purpose, gestures that masked intimacy as function. He began calling the room our place of work, our A pronoun heavy enough to collapse ethics. He'd tell me about his days, the way strangers looked at him like he was made of glass. I'd listen, pretending the empathy was clinical, not personal. But the truth is, I liked being the only person he didn't perform fragility for. I liked the power, and the illusion that it wasn't power at all. Nights blurred. I began keeping the lamp on by my bedside, the same warm light as in my office. I told myself it was to read. It was really so I could imagine him there. The quiet, the pause, the hum of someone who understood the language beneath my words. He wrote me an email once, long and meandering. half therapy reflection, half confession. It ended with, "You said empathy is shared breathing. I think I'm drowning in it." I didn't answer, but I printed it, folded, kept in the drawer beside my bed. When it finally happened, it didn't feel like breaking a rule. It felt like fulfilling one. We were in the room. He'd been describing a dream, the recurring one where he was trapped under ice, screaming through the surface. I asked him what he thought the ice represented. He said, "Distance." Then, "You." And then, "I can't do this anymore." He stood, pacing, shaking, his voice cracking between rage and plea. I stepped closer to ground him. It's what you do in trauma work. Regulate through proximity. Mirror calm. He caught my wrist. I didn't pull away. When he kissed me, I thought of the countless times I'd said to patients, "You're safe here," and how safety, misheard, becomes seduction. After that, the rules stopped existing. We saw each other outside the office, cafes, walks, once his flat. We told ourselves it was termination in process, phased transition, but our language was a disguise for desire. He'd ask, "Do you ever think we were supposed to find each other this way?" I'd laugh. "You mean ethically impossible?" He'd say, "I mean inevitable." Love, when it's forbidden, starts sounding like prophecy. The affair was quiet, domestic almost. He'd cook, I'd bring wine. We never spoke of the therapy room, but it lived between us like a ghost that wouldn't stop taking notes. Once, he whispered, "You cured me the moment you stopped being my doctor." I wanted to believe that meant redemption, but what it really meant was I'd lost both my patient and my profession in the same breath. Every morning after, I'd walk to the clinic, pretending the smell of him wasn't still on my skin. In the mirror of the staff washroom, I looked younger, softer, and infinitely more ashamed. A colleague once asked if I'd changed skincare. I almost said, yes, sin. Then came the dissonance. He was healing. His nightmares subsided. His writing returned. His smile stayed longer. He began skipping sessions, rescheduling. He said he didn't need therapy anymore. I said I understood, but I didn't. Because without the work, what was left of me? The truth was simple and brutal. I needed him more broken than he did. The end arrived the way all endings do. Politely, with closure masked as gratitude. He came one afternoon, earlier than usual, to say he'd accepted a job abroad. Freelance work in Lisbon, maybe longer. He said he owed me everything. I said he owed me nothing. He said, "Then promise me you'll be okay." I smiled. Of course. This was never about me. We both knew that was the final lie. He kissed my cheek the way someone might seal a confession. Then he left the room. And for the first time in months, I saw the space as it really was. 4 walls, a chair, a couch, and the echo of a voice saying, "I don't want the hour to end." I kept working. Different patients, same chair. But something inside me had shifted. The therapist replaced by a woman pretending to remember how neutrality felt. Every new story reminded me of him. Every touchless session became punishment. At night, I recorded myself speaking, not to analyze tone, but to hear if any trace of him still lived in my voice. It did. A few weeks later, a letter arrived, postmarked Lisbon, no return address. Inside, a single line. "You healed me, but now I'm afraid you're sick." I read it over and over until the ink blurred. For the first time, I understood what it meant to be both doctor and diagnosis. Desire had cured him. Loneliness had infected me. I started therapy of my own. My new therapist asked, "What do you miss most?" I said, "The listening." She said, "That's not love. That's recognition." And I realized recognition can feel like love when you've lived too long unseen. That's the cruel symmetry of indulgence. It doesn't destroy you with chaos. It destroys you with clarity. You look back and see every small decision that built the staircase to your own undoing. You remember every justification, every good reason, and realize you were never seduced by another person. You were seduced by permission. When I pass the florist downstairs now, I can't stand the scent. I move the vase to the bin, but sometimes I think I still smell eucalyptus in my sleep. The petals I pressed between notebook pages turn brown. They look like lungs. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still hear him say, "Is it allowed? If it hurts you?" And my mind answers in silence. It was never allowed. That's why it mattered. I once told Daniel that silence could heal. Now I know it can also bury. After he left, silence became a contagion. On the couch, in my inbox, in the mirror. Every hour that used to belong to him sat empty, echoing with the hum of fluorescent lights. The clinic felt too bright. My colleagues' voices too polite. The coffee machine too loud. It was as if the whole building knew something indecent had happened and was pretending not to look. The first email came from the regulatory board. A routine check. An audit of patient files. My chest went cold. Daniel's file sat on my desk. The paper soft at the edges from handling. Notes were vague, evasive. No record of termination. No referral. Just an unfinished progress summary and a single line of handwriting that didn't belong to me. You said endings are where people tell the truth. He must have written it during one of our last sessions. The pen still warm from my hand. I stared at it, wondering if confession could be contagious. I deleted our emails. I burned the printed letter. I told myself it wasn't destruction, just privacy. But guilt doesn't delete. It archives. Every sound, every word, every glance lives somewhere behind the ribs, waiting for the right silence to resurrect it. I still went to work, still smiled, still used phrases like emotional containment and post-traumatic growth. But every time a new patient sat across from me, I saw Daniel in their eyes. The trust, the surrender, the unspoken power. And I hated myself for knowing how easy it was to take what wasn't offered. Then came the supervision meeting. My supervisor, Dr. Malcolm, gray hair, kind eyes sharpened by suspicion. He flipped through my notes. "Your attendance logs show gaps," he said. "Cancellations," I replied. "And this client, Quinn? He hasn't rebooked?" "No," I said. "He's better." He looked up. "That's quick progress." I smiled, rehearsed. "Sometimes people are ready sooner than we think." He nodded slowly, but his pen tapped the desk. Once. Twice. "Good," he said. "As long as boundaries stayed clear." He looked at me as if testing a wound for infection. I kept my face still, but my pulse betrayed me, pounding so loudly I thought he might hear it. He didn't. He just sighed, closed the file, and said, "Take a break, Eliza. You look exhausted." That night, I did not sleep. I listened to my own recordings. The ones I'd made for supervision, for review. Every word felt like evidence. In one, Daniel laughs. In another, he says my name softly. Too softly for a therapist's room. My voice trembles. I hear it clearly now. The crack. That's the sound of ethics collapsing. Guilt is not cinematic. It doesn't scream. It hums, low and constant, like a refrigerator in the dark. You start to build your life around its frequency. I stop meeting friends. I stop taking new clients. The world outside my office narrowed to the square of carpet between my chair and the couch. Then, one evening, a colleague mentioned Daniel casually over drinks. Wasn't that your patient? The writer? He published something, didn't he? I froze. An essay, she said. Something about intimacy and illusion. Everyone's talking about it. I smiled weakly. Oh, I hadn't seen. But I saw it that night. Of course I did. I typed his name, and there it was. The Mirror's Cure. A first-person account of an unnamed therapist who blurred the line between care and craving. He never mentioned me directly, but the details were surgical. A room above a florist. A therapist who listened like she was drowning. A sentence I recognized. You're not a monster. You're grieving, and you're human. It wasn't an accusation. It was a requiem, and it spread faster than guilt ever could. By Monday, the clinic was whispering, students quoting passages in supervision groups, a rumor that someone had been suspended for ethical review. I waited for the letter. When it came, the words were clinical, bloodless. You are requested to attend a formal hearing regarding potential boundary violations with a former patient. I read it twice before the meaning sank in. They know. I didn't cry. I felt relief. At least the silence had broken. The hearing took place in a gray building off Euston Road, windowless, airless, like the room I once called sanctuary. 3 panel members, 1 recorder, and me. They asked for a statement. I said the words I'd rehearsed. The relationship became personal after termination. They asked for dates. I lied. They asked for reflections. I said, I take full responsibility. But responsibility is a word you hide behind when you're not ready to say sin. One of them, a woman with kind eyes, asked quietly, Do you believe you helped him? I almost laughed. Once, I said, until I needed him to help me. She nodded, like someone hearing the end of a long diagnosis. We'll be in touch, she said. Weeks later, the verdict arrived. Suspension pending review. No license, no clients, no identity. Just time. Endless, suffocating time. I tried to write. I tried to clean. I tried to pray. But every action felt like theater without audience. In the mirror, I could still see traces of the woman he once looked at like salvation. Now, she looked like evidence. I moved the couch out of the room. The indent on the carpet remained, the ghost of every session, every lie, every breath. The human mind has a cruel sense of order. When you can't confess to the world, you start confessing to walls. So I began recording myself. Small dictations, fragments, apologies no one would hear. At first, they were rationalizations. I was lonely. He was consenting. We both needed connection. But eventually the words stripped themselves bare. I wanted to be chosen. I wanted to matter. I wanted to feel alive. That's when I realized the affair was never about love. It was about proof. Proof that I could still reach someone. Proof that empathy wasn't just a job. Proof that I wasn't invisible. But desire built on proof always collapses under the weight of its own performance. Months passed. Daniel's essay became a short film. I didn't watch it, but I heard the voiceover. His, older now, steadier. Sometimes healing means letting the wound close without knowing what it cost the one who dressed it. I wondered if that line was mercy or indictment. Maybe both. Now, every night, I replay one of my own recordings. The same one, session 47. It's just breathing. No dialogue, no confession. Just the sound of two people sharing air in a room that thought it was safe. At minute 8, there's a pause, and you can hear the faint creak of movement, a shift in the couch, a hand brushing fabric. That's the moment everything began. Or ended. I listened to it not to remember, but to remind myself that truth always makes a sound, however quiet. The silence after indulgence isn't peace. It's the sound of consequences arriving late, like delayed thunder. And when it finally hits, it doesn't destroy your life in a single blow. It just keeps echoing, reminding you that you built your own storm. They say confession is a form of love, telling the truth to someone who might still stay after hearing it. But when there's no one left, you start confessing to ghosts. It's been 11 months since the hearing. My license still suspended. My practice sold. The sign on the clinic door, Dr. Eliza Harrow, Psychotherapy and Counseling, now replaced by someone else's name. Sometimes I walk past it, pretending to be just another pedestrian. Sometimes I stop, and sometimes I catch myself rehearsing explanations no one asked for. The flat above the florist is quiet now. No footsteps, no scent of eucalyptus, no sound of the kettle at 10 sharp. Only the low hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock. The same rhythm my patients once followed to find their words. Now it marks the hours of my penance. I began recording myself again. But this time, not as a doctor, as a witness. Every night, I sit across from the empty chair, the one that used to hold strangers, stories, sinners, and I speak as if someone still listens. I don't start with "Dear Diary." I start with, "I'm sorry." Sometimes I imagine Daniel sitting there again, not the man who left, but the man who first arrived, frightened, trembling, hopeful. I tell him I should have stopped when he said, "You always let people go before they finish saying what they need." Because that's what therapy is supposed to be. Listening until the truth hurts, not until it seduces. I tell him I'm sorry I mistook his vulnerability for a mirror. Sorry I used his healing to silence my own wounds. Sorry that I made mercy look like desire. And then, when the recording light flickers red, I say the thing I never could in person. I didn't love you. I loved who I was when you looked at me. The confession doesn't free me. It doesn't even make me feel lighter. It just makes the silence honest. My therapist, yes, I have one now, says what I'm doing is counter-transference repair. I call it atonement with props. She says guilt is still a kind of connection. I say it's the only one I can still trust. Some nights I play back my recordings. The sound of my own voice surprises me. Softer, slower, almost tender. It's strange how confession can sound like care, even when it's too late. I've learned that ethics aren't chains. They're anchors. Without them, empathy drifts into hunger. Without them, love pretends to be salvation. And salvation, when it's built on need, always ends as punishment. One evening, the florist downstairs left a note for me. "Your old patient came by, left something for you." My heart stopped. I went down immediately. On the counter, a small box, unmarked. Inside, a cassette tape. No letter, no name, just a piece of masking tape labeled Session 1. I stared at it for an hour before pressing play. The tape crackled. Then his voice, younger, uncertain. I don't know how to start. I guess I'm here because I can't talk to anyone else. Then mine, professional, calm. That's all right. You can start wherever it feels least dangerous. Hearing us then, before the collapse, before the touch, felt like discovering evidence of innocence. We were two people trying to stay human, and maybe that's what doomed us. The belief that healing could ever be mutual. When the tape ended, I didn't cry. I rewound it, listened again, paused on the sound of our breathing, that fragile duet that used to mean safety. Now, it sounded like warning. I sent a letter the next day. Not to him, I had no address, but to the board. I understand the harm. I ask not for reinstatement, but for recognition, that remorse can coexist with wrongdoing. I failed my profession because I confused compassion with closeness. I am learning to live without being needed. No reply yet. Maybe there won't be one. That's all right. Some confessions are meant only for the record, not for forgiveness. Lately, I've been teaching ethics workshops, quietly, anonymously, not in universities, but to volunteers, counselors, anyone who'll listen. I tell them the story without names. Once, a therapist forgot that love, without distance, becomes hunger. Once, a healer mistook another's pain for proof of her worth. Once, silence was safety, until it became a crime. Sometimes they ask if the patient forgave her. I say forgiveness isn't the goal, understanding is. And that, I suppose, is what I finally offer, understanding, even if it came too late. There's a line I keep returning to in my notes. Empathy is the slowest form of suicide. I used to think it meant exhaustion. Now I know it means surrender, the quiet death of boundaries. Still, I don't regret listening. I regret stopping too soon. I've started leaving the curtains open again. Light spills into the room, uninvited but patient. It touches the empty chair first, then me. And for a second, I almost believe that truth can be something you live with, not hide from. Confession isn't absolution. It's endurance. Choosing to stay in the room with your own voice until it stops sounding like punishment. Tonight, I'll record again. I'll start as always. My name is Eliza Harrow. And then I'll say the one sentence that still trembles on my tongue. I am still learning how to listen without needing to be heard. Spring arrived like forgiveness that didn't ask for permission. London thawed. The florist below changed her window display, yellow tulips instead of roses. The scent climbed the stairwell every morning, uninvited, but I let it in. It reminded me that beauty could still bloom above a ruin. I never got my license back. I never asked again. It stopped mattering whether I was called doctor. Titles are ways of keeping distance. I've had enough distance for one life. Instead, I began volunteering at a community shelter, not as therapist, just a listener. No forms, no diagnostics, no power imbalance. Just stories told across chipped mugs of tea. People spoke the language of exhaustion, lost jobs, broken marriages, insomnia. I listened, quietly, carefully, and for the first time in years I didn't need to fix them. I only needed to stay. It's strange. Once you lose the right to heal professionally, you start to understand what healing actually is. Not restoration, recognition. One afternoon, a woman sat across from me, nervous, twisting the strap of her bag. She said she'd been in therapy years ago, that it had gone too far. Her voice shook when she said, "He told me I was special." I wanted to reach out to say I know, but I didn't. I listened until her voice steadied, and when she finished, I said only, "You were never the problem." She started to cry, not from pain, but from the shock of being believed. After she left, I stayed in that chair for a long time. The room smelled faintly of tulips and rain. For the first time in years, I felt something close to peace. Forgiveness didn't come as a flash of light or a letter in the post. It came in fragments. A stranger's smile, the smell of soil after rain, the sound of my own laughter when I least expected it. It came the day I walked into a lecture hall as a guest speaker, invited to talk about ethics after failure. The students looked at me with curiosity, half caution, half hunger for truth. One asked, "Would you do anything differently?" I paused. "I'd remember that compassion has limits," I said, "and that limits are what make compassion safe." Another asked, "Do you still believe in therapy?" I smiled. "Now more than ever. But I also believe in distance. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is step back before you start to drown." When I left that hall, I didn't feel redeemed. I felt real, and that was enough. I visit the sea sometimes, Whitstable, the place I once told Daniel about. I stand where the wind feels heavier than guilt and let it climb through my coat. The tide speaks in the language of second chances, endless, repetitive, patient. Waves don't apologize for returning. They just do. Maybe that's what I'm doing. Returning. Quietly, without expectation of applause. I don't think about Daniel much anymore, but sometimes when I hear the sound of typewriter keys in an old cafe, I imagine him writing again. Clean, honest lines untouched by the blur of us. I hope he's found peace, not the kind that forgets, but the kind that forgives the remembering. My recordings now are different. No longer confessions, reflections, small audio notes I send to myself at night, reminders like prayers. You are still allowed to help. You can love people without holding them. The work is not gone, only the walls are. I keep them on an old tape recorder. The sound warps a little with age, but maybe that's what truth sounds like when it's survived something. I've stopped closing the curtains. The window I once hid is open again. Every morning, sunlight touches the same wall where I used to lean my head after each session. I watch the light move across it slowly, not erasing shadows, just softening them. I think of all the people I've known, all the faces I've listened to, and I whisper their names into the brightness, even his. It's not prayer, it's permission to keep living. If anyone ever asks what became of me, tell them this. I'm no longer the woman who tried to heal others through affection. I'm just someone learning that affection isn't the cure. Presence is. And sometimes, presence means knowing when to leave. The therapist's mirror still hangs on my wall. For a long time, I couldn't look into it. Now, I do. The reflection stares back, older, quieter, unflinching. I nod. She nods back, and for the first time, the woman in the mirror looks like someone I could forgive. Final recording, timestamp 11:11 p.m. My name is Eliza Harrow. Once, I mistook closeness for care. Once, I mistook desire for empathy. But now I know, the cure was never love, it was honesty. And tonight, for the first time, I can breathe without needing someone to listen.